And ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Morning Shot. And today I have a special guest with me, and that's Anthea Jefferys, the very acclaimed Anthea Jeffery, the author of the books Countdown to Socialism, and your other one, obviously, in the People's War. So, hello, welcome to the show. First time I'm actually interviewing you, so thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me.
Thank you, Byron. It's great to be here with you.
I thought we could start off on your book, Countdown to Socialism. So, obviously, your book, Countdown to Socialism, highlights the ANC's ideological bend towards the NDR. Can you explain for my audience what the NDR is?
Sure, it's a Soviet-inspired program. It's the second stage of a two-stage revolution. The first requirement is to gain power. The second aim is to use that power to implement the National Democratic Revolution, which in essence is a strategy to take a country which is primarily has a free market economy towards a socialist economy. And there's some rather woolly, poorly explained idea that socialism now will be different from what it was in the era of the Soviet Union, that we can dispense with central planning, that it will not be bureaucratic, it will be democratic socialism. But of course, every attempt at socialism that has ever been made has failed, and the proponents of it tend to deny that that failure has occurred.
Now, what's interesting is if you look at the ANC and the South African Communist Party, the two of them seem to have different views of what the NDR means. Could you explain that a little bit?
I don't think that they really do. I think that any differences are really very small differences of nuance. I think that it's the SACP that is effectively the dominant partner, that where it leads, the ANC tends to follow. And you can see that, for example, if you have a look at the resolutions which are passed at the SACP congresses, which normally take place about 6 months or a little bit less before the ANC's conference. So in 2022, for example, the SACP held a congress in July 2022 in which they talked about the needs of the NDR and what steps were required in the 5 years to come. And then in December, the ANC held its conference, its national conference, the one where Cyril Ramaphosa was re-elected as ANC president. And many of the decisions that it make very echo what the SACP has previously said. And I think that's interesting too, that Cyril Ramaphosa, in addressing that SACP Congress in July, said that both the ANC and the SACP were deeply committed to the NDR, that this was the common program of the two of them and the reason for the existence of their alliance. And he also talked about that even within the ANC, where I think that there's often a belief that there's a more conservative element, that there are no divisions on ideology and policy. The divisions that exist are those over who gets access to positions and hence resources.
It's an interesting thing because obviously with the South African Communist Party now suggesting that it's going to compete independently of the ANC at the next local government elections, and Fikile Mbalula himself has started to say things about the ANC not being a socialist party, that was the goal of the SACP historically, and him alluding to at points a degree of free market bend whilst at the same time doing everything to not encourage a free market bend. There does seem to be a little bit of confusion in the ANC at the moment as to whether or not it's still wedded to a socialist ideology. What's your view on that?
I think they are absolutely, that some sort of justificatory words will be used from time to time. I think there is obviously I would see it as a false sense of division that's being portrayed at the moment over the role of the DA within the GNU. That it's important to the ANC to have brought in the DA as the party with the biggest number of seats, easiest to get them over the line when they need a 51% majority. And I think that many of them are probably also hoping, as we heard, in fact, that this would turn out to be an equivalent of Lenin's new economic policy, that by pretending to be really interested in reform, they could, in many ways, as it were, blunt the extent of the criticism to which they have been subjected, and they could persuade the DA to stay in despite their inability to influence policy in any real way. And at the end of the day, the DA's supporters would be impatient with the party for having stayed in for so long and would be weakened by the process, whereas the ANC then hopes to get back to having a 50% majority in its own right, or with the help of some rats and mice parties following the 2029 election. And that the SACP has elected to stand in a local government election, I think, again, is not particularly important. They did stand in a particular constituency in a local government election a little while ago. This is the first time they said they're going to stand more generally in an election in their own right. But I think it's, again, can just be seen as part of a flurry of accusation against some in the ANC for having dared to get in bed with the DA, whereas all of them are probably agreed that this is quite a good way of weakening the DA if the goal can be achieved.
So what's your view then going forward? Obviously, the GNU's in place, the DA's there. Do you still see the political program carrying on as expected? Is this all going to plan, or is it not going to plan? What's your view?
I think it is very much still going to plan, except perhaps for that, but let's come back to that. Because we've had, since the GNU was formed, very strong commitments by the ANC to the NDR. For example, that they had adopted a new program for political training for all their members, old and new, in which they said that instilling a commitment to the NDR was the fundamental goal. We also had the ANC's 8th January statement this year, in which Cyril Ramaphosa again stressed a strong commitment, the ANC's strong commitment to the NDR. And we get such rhetoric coming out. If we have a look at what's happening on the policy front, we see that there was this big push just before the 2024 election to really get a lot of bills through Parliament. And that was successfully achieved in their damaging bills, from the NHI bill to the Expropriation Act as it is now, to the Public Procurement Act and the Employment Equity Amendment Act and the Bella Act. And all these things are important to the NDR in various ways. They were pushed through, and in many ways, all that the ANC need do now with those particular laws is to flesh them out by means of regulation. And so we've seen that, for example, with the Employment Equity Amendment Act, with the new regulations which have just come out, which can be done by ministerial subordinate rulemaking, and which probably, there's going to be an argument as to whether the minister has the power to enact those regulations. But the fight now is going to be over the regulations and not so much over new legislation, because so much has already been put onto the statute book. That doesn't mean to say that we won't from time to time have new regulation, which we'd rather not have, but a great deal can be achieved by regulation, and that's where the focus now falls. And to my mind, there's no indication that the ANC is backpedaling from the NDR.
Yeah, I do wonder, though, whether or not actually the average ANC individual inside the ANC, outside of let's call them the brainchilds of the ANC, whether they actually understand what the NDR is. Because certainly when you talk to certain individuals in the ANC, accordingly, it's a way to transform the economy and to bring black individuals back into the fold so that they can become economically active through democratic means. That's how they describe it. And then there's obviously your definition, or the SACP definition, which would be to create the circumstances to which you can usher in socialism. So it seems to me like individuals within the ANC itself don't really know what they themselves are signing up to. Is that fair, or am I misreading it?
No, I think that's absolutely true. And it was interesting, for example, if one goes back a little bit in time to some opinion polling that was done in 2017 by R.W. Johnson, in the run-up to, whether we were going to have Cyril Ramaphosa or NDZ as our ANC president. So it was important to find out the views of ANC voters across the country. And what Bill Johnson discovered was that, as we've confirmed over and again in our opinion polling at the IRR, that really the average South African voter is pretty pragmatic, including the ANC voter. And so there's actually turned out to be a kind of vast disconnect between what the ANC elite, the 4,000 or so people, delegates who attend the conference and make the decisions for the next 5 years, what they are committed to, and what the ordinary ANC voter would like to see, which, for example, at that time was put as business-friendly policies, which they hoped that Cyril the businessman would be able to deliver, rather than the massive redistribution. There wasn't much faith in that as a solution. So I think there's this disconnect between the ANC elite and between the ANC voter. And the ANC voters presumably hope that by continuing to support the party, things that they rely on, like social grants, some of the patronage, the belief that perhaps in time these policies will bring benefits to those further down in the structure of society, will work out. But I think that the ANC is also pretty much past masters of what I will call either propaganda or disinformation, where you spin a story, you make it sound terribly attractive, but what you're really planning to do is unlikely to help the people at the bottom, as we can now see from 30 years of these policies, and is simply adding to the power of those at the top. And through the power that they're accumulating, the very top dogs are also able to accumulate considerable wealth. So there's an obvious self-interest too in pursuing this, and at the same time saying that all that they are doing is trying to create a utopia for the ordinary people of the country, and that their policies are the ones that are going to usher in this brave new world. So I think that socialism is really one of the ideologies that perhaps makes it easiest to be looking for power and wealth at the same time as you promise to be helping people and promoting equality. There's no equality in a socialist system, and between the people at the very top and the people at the bottom, there's just perhaps an equality of suffering at the bottom.
Yeah, I think we're both in agreement with that. So, I mean, the question I would also then ask is it not fair to say that the individuals that appear to be mostly wedded to these type of ideas seem to all be individuals that were trained during, should we call it the apartheid struggle time, people that were trained in Russia by the Soviets or abroad by the Soviets? These are people that were deeply wedded to Soviet ideology, but the reality is that many of those individuals are dying off now, and so it's questionable as to what element these policies will still have a sway going forward. Certainly amongst the younger voter, do you have a sense of that, or am I off the mark?
I think that, again, for the cadres within the movement, there is constant political education and reinforcement of the message. And again, it will be geared, I would say, quite a cynical misuse, perhaps, of the idealism of some of the people who join the ANC genuinely wanting to help. But through political education, they really, and the propaganda, they can be persuaded that these policies are good, whereas I think the people at the very top are quite cynical and know that they are using others. I think also that the political education is promoted via the political school established in Tanzania with Chinese money and expertise, which aims to keep providing political education to the liberation movements across Southern Africa, of which the ANC is one. One of its key goals in 2023, 2024 was to make sure that in all the elections that were coming up in 2024, the liberation parties would win again, or at least be able to retain their power, as the ANC was able to do through the Government of National Unity. So it's an ongoing process. It didn't stop in 1994 when the ANC won power. And I think if you look at the global circumstances, I do think that the ANC also believes that socialism didn't fail. It's just never been properly tried. as Joe Slovo wrote in 1989, just about the time that the Berlin Wall came down. And that what they are working towards is a new form of socialism, this democratic socialism that I mentioned at the beginning, which is not bureaucratic, but really will be, make sure that people are in charge of both production and distribution, and that somehow we won't need a central plan anymore. It's very hard to imagine how this is going to work. One of the options is that you don't allow private ownership as we see it now, where people have both the right to use their property and to sell their property. They own it in the true sense. They want to sort of divide ownership up into a bundle of rights, and they will have the custodianship right, and ordinary people might be allowed the use right, but the custodianship right is going to be what really counts. Yeah. And a custodian is normally somebody who has a fiduciary duty to act in the best interests of the beneficiaries and can be fired if they don't fulfill that duty. But you make the state the custodian, and who's going to fire the state as custodian? It just breaks down in that context. But I think that's the kind of thinking which is now quite widespread, and that the ANC probably takes some level of comfort from the fact that there are the West seems to be in trouble, seems to be on the retreat, that there are various governments around the world which are pursuing socialist policies, including Venezuela, which they often seem to see as some kind of model. So it's not as if we really are in Fukuyama's world beyond, we've seen the end of history. It's carrying on.
It's interesting. So what's your view then in terms of, because all the polling is showing that the ANC in the next election, if they had an election today, I think they're like polling at 30%. I mean, their numbers are down, severely down.
Yes. Yeah.
So what's your view then, if I were to say to you, what's your 10-year view of what will happen in South Africa? Off the top of your head, what's your predictions? How do you think things will go?
Well, I hope very much that the DA is right and that we can, the electorate will at some point really lose any illusions that they might still have about the ANC and be able to vote it out. We'll have faith that there is a credible alternative, which is something that the ANC has put a great deal of effort into, destroying the notion that we have a credible alternative. We need that belief to be strong and powerful, so that all the people who stop voting will come back to the poll and actually vote for someone else. If you look back to 2012, that was the first election in which the number of people not voting was greater than the number of people voting for the ANC. And every election since then, the number of people not voting further outstripped the number of people voting for the ANC.
It's because people don't really see that the voting actually does anything. That's the view.
Yes, I think there's a sort of sense that, well, who else is there to vote for? DA much stigmatized, they're going to bring back apartheid. Maybe that belief has been undermined by its participation in the GNU, but there's an awful lot of stigmatization of the DA that's happening now, intended to make it really beyond the pale for many people. And if we don't have an alternative, then the real risk is that people will still say, well, I'm not going to vote for the ANC. I'm going to punish them by not voting for them. But not voting for anybody else makes it easier for them to retain power. So we need to break that pattern, which is a well-established pattern. Maybe it can be done. Yes, but I fear that the ANC will also perhaps use other mechanisms of retaining power. We know that in other countries, such as Venezuela, the last election was deeply unfair. The opposition, against all the odds, managed to marshal evidence by collating with all the outcomes at polling booths.
Well, they were bribing people with chickens and eggs. I mean, there was numerous videos of them saying, if you vote for us, here's a chicken and an egg, because obviously it's a country with acute food shortages. So they bribed people with food. Yeah,
so it's a mixture of the patronage, which becomes more and more important as the government attains more and more control, and there isn't much prospect of attaining a good life through getting a job and seeing your living conditions improve. And the other thing that they can use is cheating, because undoubtedly in the Venezuelan election that was stolen. But it hasn't made any difference to the fact that President Maduro is still the president. I'm wary of the
7-year
fact,
president, I might add. It's quite a long
yeah,
period.
yes, and also, even when the opposition in Venezuela won a two-thirds majority back in 2015, the ruling party somehow managed to subvert that by then bringing in a new constitution with a constituent assembly to draw it up that seemed to have more power than parliament, and a judiciary that wasn't willing to draw the line and say no. Partly because I think the highest court was packed and filled with many people loyal to the government. So there are many ways in which, unfortunately, what the ANC has been doing to weaken our checks and balances can be taken further. It disturbs me that our Independent Electoral Commission is now examining the possibility of electronic voting. And they seem to have done a great deal of homework on this. They seem to be quite determined to push it through.
They saw
Last
what
time
happened
they
in
tried it
America
a
at
bit
Biden.
rather, it was a kind of half-assed attempt, but this is going to be quite serious. And it may be in place by 2029, and then really it will depend largely on who counts the votes rather than how people vote.
So I think there's that perception, though, that they saw the US election with Biden, and obviously, rightly or wrongly, whether you believe it was or wasn't, actually it's immaterial. But obviously, as you know, there was widespread allegations that the in-voting, the electronic voting, was crooked, which helped Biden get the most votes of any US president in history. Whether or not that was true or not is immaterial. But what is factual is that I suspect that the ANC saw that and thought, oh, that could work. Let's do that. And
Yes.
that
Yeah.
it meant that for the rest of us, when we saw the majority of us was just like, you can see where this is going. But I think they
Yeah.
had the same kind of electoral, well, there's allegations of electoral fraud in Namibia and Mozambique for similar kind
Yes.
of arguments.
Yeah, that's right. And I think an electronic system can be less transparent than a paper-based one. And I think, again, Venezuela, despite everything that was done to say these are the accurate results, the electronic ones showed the opposite, and that was what prevailed in the end.
I mean, it was curious because obviously when the ANC were having their last elective conference, one of the lines that came out of it was that they see themselves to be ideologically aligned with South American countries that particularly push forward forms of socialism. But it's also curious to see what's happening in South America because, as you know, in Argentina, they've got Milei. Milei is not a socialist. And they've obviously got Bukele in El Salvador, and he's not a socialist either. And so there
Right.
does seem to be a bit of a pushback against socialist policies in South America. I mean, Panama is more aligned now with the United States. And you could keep mentioning countries that have similar economic persuasions. So what's your sense of what that will mean for the ANC's allyship, as they seem to be so keen to say that this is an idea that they imbibe, but that idea is disappearing. So now what?
Yeah, I think these countervailing pressures are very important. So it's good to recall them. That there was a period where you seem to have a sort of pink tide advancing through Latin America, but now that's not nearly as clear, and you've got some reversals, some very amazing ones, as you say, particularly in Argentina. In a way, you could say that the Trump electoral victory is also part of that countervailing force, that the Democrats went too far with things which really many Democratic voters, let alone Republican voters, were concerned about, from the extent of illegal immigration to the extent to which race was now dominating, and particularly not just race, a version of it, the equity and diversity inclusion formula,
DEI.
which seemed to be die, as I prefer to call it, that yes, it really bothered people that their children were being exposed to this. It bothered them that the federal government seemed to be full of this kind of program. The false dichotomy between oppressors and victims was not something that Americans felt comfortable with. And so I think these were factors that helped bring Trump to power. Now, how much he can actually use the executive orders and other things successfully to not only roll back, but keep these policies rolled back. I think it gives us hope, but we're not out of the woods yet. And for the ANC, I think they will look to other examples and think, well, we have company too on our path to socialism. It's up for grabs, perhaps, and that's good. That we're not the sort of the last country in the world that's sort of just about to fall into the socialist corral. But there are many in that corral or moving towards it, and there are others in other groups, and so there's still a contest, a real contest, and that's good.
I think it's curious because if you look at Africa itself, there's also a bend in some, I'm not saying all, but some African economies are also pushing away from socialism. And we've seen this in Zambia, for example, where they managed to actually get themselves out of this loop. And we're seeing similar things in places such as Ethiopia and so forth. But I think it's curious that the ANC now seems to be saying it's now its new ally, which, contrary to its anti-colonialist rhetoric, appears to be places like Britain with Keir Starmer, who's obviously arguably more socialist-leaning, and obviously the European Union, which seems to be dominated with forms of socialist ideology. And it appears that the ANC is like, okay, well, now they are friends because they understand the program that we want to adopt, even though logically you shouldn't want to do anything with them because technically colonialism and they're the oppressor, right? So it does show you that, I suppose, from a political paradigm, that they don't really care who the ally is so long as the ally agrees with them.
Yes, and the ally can bring something to help them. And I think just recently, with all the criticism that has come from the US, having support from the EU, from Europe, has been very useful. That the ANC can cite that and say, well, it's just Trump who's a bit
Well, that's
crazy.
exactly what they've done. Yeah,
Trump
that's
the
exactly
chump.
what they've done.
Yeah.
So actually, focusing on then that Trump issue. Obviously, as you know, Trump extended a refugee offer to Afrikaners and cited some of the policy in South Africa as being problematic: expropriation without compensation, and the DEI initiatives. The Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, said that he wouldn't come to the G20 because the G20 was basically an attempt to progress socialist or communist type agendas on the G20. There's been numerous discussions now around, Senator Jackson says that in his view, South Africa is a DEI and CRT initiative embodied in a country as a whole. And so there's a lot of pressure coming from various US lawmakers to say that South Africa isn't a good model, and as a result, they're actually trying to extend some form of aid. What's your view? What's your take on all that? Why do you think that's all happening?
Well, I think they've rightly identified laws which are extraordinarily damaging. They've got it wrong in saying that the Expropriation Act is already in place and seizures are already happening. But the flagging of laws which are damaging to the country is right. But what I would say is that we should look to the people who are hurt the worst by these laws and have been for decades, and that is the poor black majority. So one wouldn't want to see harm come to any group of any color. But if one is looking at where the greatest harm is being done and the greatest suffering is as a result, I would say it's among the poor black majority, who are constantly told in the context for BEE, for example, that this is being done to help them. But we know now from experience that the poor are harmed by these interventions, that the people who benefit are very much a relatively small black elite, often the politically connected cadres, and that the more the ANC tightens up these rules, the more actually they are pursuing the NDR, the more impossible they are making it for business to flourish, and the more power they are giving to the state. And the more, for ordinary black South Africans facing a crisis of unemployment, often of hunger, of stunting, of a sort of loss of hope, these are just dreadful interventions. So I think it's a pity that the Trump administration, in calling out these laws as being so damaging, hasn't also recognized what harm they bring to the great majority.
I wonder though if it's not easier though to single out one specific ethnicity than everyone. Because if you were to talk on the country's policies as a whole, the ANC would attempt to, as you know, I mean, I think this is one of the reasons that the US is not that keen to have roundtable discussions with the ANC, because they know that the round discussion won't be, what are you doing wrong? How can you reverse it? It will be the ANC attempting to say, we can basically recolor in this picture and make it look a bit nicer to you. We can use different words to describe the same things, and maybe those words will sound better. It's not race-based legislation, it's transformation. It's not expropriation of property or land theft, it's redistribution. It's not socialist policies that attempt to do Robin Hood type activity, it's transformation. So, as we know, the ANC has their buzzwords and they like to use them. And I think that at the moment, it would appear that the Trump administration is not stupid. Like they understand what's going to happen, and that's why they consider the conversations to be, well, pointless, because there's not going to be any logical outcome. So it would appear that the suggestion to go after Afrikaners is nothing more than it's an easy linchpin. You can say, well, here's how these policies affect this minority, and obviously minority rights are a key point of interest to the US in terms of its, should we call it, its dedication to human rights. But I'm curious to get an understanding from you specifically. Do you see South Africa as being a place of hope, or is it like we're beyond the cliff now and it's a managed decline? What's your view?
That's a really tough one because one always wants hope, and there always is hope somewhere in our hearts, and that's a good thing. Um, and I think also what has happened now with the VAT issue is important because I think Helen Ziller has rightly said that when it came to the laws which had already been adopted by the Sixth Parliament, it was harder for the GNU partners who came in afterwards to object. Because the ANC immediately said, well, this was passed by the legislature and now they have to be implemented. That's the obligation that the president has, which is right, except that most of those laws are unconstitutional. And so his real obligation is to send them back to Parliament to be reworked.
For reconsideration, yeah.
Yes. So there, but now with the VAT increase, this was something new. This was passing the budget, and the DA was able to say no the first time around and say no the second time around. And then through its litigation aimed very much on procedural issues and the unconstitutionality of giving the finance minister the power to implement a VAT change without Parliament's say-so. Those are powerful legal arguments which I think the courts would be hard-pressed to deny because they are of a procedural kind and they don't tackle the transformation project, as it were, outright. They just say this has been badly and wrongly done. And they keep on saying quite correctly that what we must have is growth, investment, jobs, that this is the only way to bring back life to South Africans, that this is what they signed up for when they joined the GNU. This is their mandate. And they're going to push for it. I think, though, so that is very positive. And we will see when the next iteration of the budget comes on the 21st of May. Obviously, they can't do a tax increase again. Are they really going to do anything spending about the cutting of spending that is sensible? They'll be tempted to say, because of the DA's intransigence, we now can't employ this number of foundation school teachers, so blame the DA. What they should be doing is to say, IRR and others have been telling us that there's about 150 billion being wasted each year on BEE premiums, either the ones that are authorized by law or the ones that just happen under the table, where you get vastly inflated prices and an enormous waste, therefore, of scarce tax revenues. And if we just did what Sonder recommended, we had value for money procurement in all circumstances, we choose procurement partners on the basis of their cost efficiency and what they can deliver, that would save 150 billion. Then we could
Yeah.
bring down the VAT rate. We could really start persuading investors that the country is a safer one in which to invest because there's been an important change on a key issue. But it's very unlikely to happen. And I think part of the tragedy was something.
Sounds to me, like, according to Cyril, you sound that like you have a gripe against transformation, and it sounds very much like you don't want there to be transformation, because that's what you told the DA. But I think it's curious that Cyril also made it clear in one of his sonas that whilst he has a constitutional and democratic obligation on the state to have value added and to make sure that he actually gets his bang for his buck, he did also say that that didn't matter to him, specifically in relation to the preferential procurement framework, that he wanted it, he didn't mind if things cost more money because transformation was more important than the cost to the state.
Yes, it's it sounds good, but if you just unpack it a bit, it really is so fake, in the sense that if you are wasting 150 billion and putting it in the pockets of cadres, then there's 150 billion less to provide the services that the poorest people most urgently need, and he doesn't talk about that. And yes, I am opposed to the ANC's version of transformation because I think there are much better ways in which we can get the economy growing, bring people into employment, and do something we have initiatives that do reach right down to the grassroots and provide people who are at the bottom of the ladder with a real opportunity of climbing up it. And so we've been saying, you may have heard for many years, that we should replace BEE with what I call economic empowerment for the disadvantaged. Where
They have that. They
intervention,
have that in the UK. They have means testing. Like means testing is a very well established principle in UK law, and means testing will be based on your economic situation, not your race, creed, or religion.
exactly. And we use means testing already for the social grants, so it's not as if we don't have information available. But then we must do something also that actually takes, that truly empowers people at the bottom. And I think our voucher idea would do that. If you take tax-funded vouchers, say, for schooling, we know that about 80% of our public schools are dysfunctional, that they're failing to turn out people who are even functionally literate and numerate. So a lot of the vast amount of money that we spend on education is really being wasted. But if you took most of that money, divided it up into vouchers for the poor, the families who receive those vouchers would be really intent on making sure that their children get the best possible schooling. And all the schools would have to start competing for the custom of those parents, including the public ones. And there would be more independent schools and maybe NGO-run schools and so on that would spring up to meet this new market. And it's been tried in other countries, it's worked. It's something that the ANC would absolutely hate because it would empower ordinary people, not the
Take away
cadres.
control. So it gives people choice.
It would make it easier for business to invest and expand and grow and offer jobs. It would break the sort of stranglehold that the ANC has been putting over the economy in the name of the poor.
But I believe they use this voucher system in the US, and they use it rather efficiently for individuals that don't meet certain income thresholds. So similar thing, they apply means testing and then apply a voucher. And what
Yes.
it effectively does is it gives them the ability to make a choice. So if you know you've got a food voucher, well, let's say an educational voucher, you at least gives you a choice of which schools to stick your kid in. You're not just told, well, go to the local state school over there because that's the only choice you got, and we're telling you that that's where you have to go.
Yes.
But
And in that
curiously,
situation,
sorry?
sorry, I was going to say, and in that situation, even if you have quite dedicated teachers, you have a system which is geared against the interests of the children in that school because there's no competition, because they know the kids are stuck there irrespective of whether they're learning or not learning. Whereas if there's competition, it's a trigger for innovation. It means that the schools really have to up their game and hold down their costs.
So what's your long-term plan then, though, for South Africa? If you had kids, and your kids were 5 years old.
Mm.
I'm making this up, but it's just an example.
Right.
Would you tell them to stay and fight or to take Trump's offer?
Oh, that's a tough one. Yeah,
As
probably
a as
wouldn't
a, as a, as
qualify
a,
for
as a
Trump's
mother, you
offer.
must have an opinion.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm not an Afrikaner, so I doubt I'd qualify. But yeah, I think that's one of the hardest things because, we now look at these employment equity quotas, which sort of indicate that 4.1% is the maximum for white employment. And of course, white people who already have jobs can't really be fired just because of the color of their skin. So they have some level of protection. But for the young coming up, for the new entrants to the labor market, one fears that even though we desperately need skills, it's going to be harder to find opportunities. So yeah, I think there would
Unless
be
you're a
in a
small
sense of
enterprise below 50 individuals, in which case the rules don't apply.
yes, but there are also you really do need the combination of the bigger companies and the smaller companies for a truly thriving economy, and the
I would
capacity
agree
to absorb.
entirely.
Yeah.
But it does appear that the ANC is wedded to this idea of like the smaller enterprise economy. I don't really know where they got that idea from because I don't really know of any advanced economies that have these ample SMEs everywhere, and that's all they have. Usually, for a
Mm.
country to become a powerhouse, they do need the really large corporates, and China certainly understands that, and so does the US. But
Mm.
yeah, apparently the rules don't apply underneath 50 people, irrespective of turnover. So I suspect that ANC's arguments to that will be if you want to have a white-owned company, then contract some of your stuff out to black companies and increase your procurement that way.
I'm
That's
sure that
maybe
they
like your HR, contract out your HR to I don't know, black-owned company, and maybe that's the option.
mm. And it could work for some companies. They would obviously have to be careful not to be seen to be splitting up their operation to avoid the implementation of the act, because that would be illegal. It may be feasible for some to achieve that. But nevertheless, it's another constraint on the economy. It's
Mm,
another reason for any new investor coming in to think, well, what is the skills level within the country? What have been done to build up skills within the majority population? And the
mm,
answer, unfortunately, is frighteningly little.
mm,
Um, and now, if you're barred from using the skills that do exist, then it's a much harder thing to make a success of a new enterprise. So particularly in terms of investment, which is the key to growth and then to expanding employment, we battle again even more to achieve this. And the other thing that's going to happen with this law is that if companies don't manage to fulfill the targets, as ANC would prefer us to call them, then they can be barred from procurement with the state. And
mm,
that again will be enormously damaging because um, it's back to what was struck down in particular legal circumstances a while ago, pre-qualification criteria. And once you have those, then certain companies, irrespective of how well they can do the job, can't be considered at all.
mm.
They're just ruled out. And it's only the remainder that can compete. And we know that there'll be a vast array of
Connected individuals.
backhanders and connected
Mm,
individuals that are likely to be the ones that win the contracts, which is again terrible for the economy as a whole, good for the cadres, bad for everybody else, and particularly for those at the very bottom of the ladder who need to have a ladder that's working well, that they can climb.
mm. Cool. Well, I really do thank you for your time. I don't want to keep you on here all day long. I know that we said we would go until 3 at the time of recording. So I must say thank you very much for joining me to talk to me about the NDR. It's a comment that obviously gets raised quite a lot, especially online with podcasters. We all reference the NDR, having read literature such as yourself and the arguments that you push forward, but actually few of the audience really understand what the NDR means and what it means to the practical application against the country as a whole. So really do
Mhm.
thank you for taking the time to talk to me about it.
Can I say one more thing about that? Because I think you're
Absolutely.
absolutely right. And part of the reason, of course, is that the mainstream media on the whole does not talk about the NDR. And they do tend to paint the ANC's policies in, if not glowing terms, then at least in sympathetic terms. The argument for redress gets a good deal of play. But obviously, it's one thing to look at the so-called objectives of a law, another to look at the actual outcomes. And the actual outcomes are just kind of swept away on the whole. And if we only had more attention paid to the ANC's ideology, to the fact that this NDR is the lodestar that they've been gravitating around for decades and still do, perhaps it would be easier to communicate to most people what it is that we're worried about and how badly it overshadows the country.
Yeah, but I mean, I think you see this in corporate South Africa too, right? And this is an argument that we've made certainly on Morning Show a lot. In that corporate South Africa tends to placate the ANC a lot. They tend to kind of humor them. They repeat a lot of the ANC's lines, whilst not really understanding what the ANC is actually doing. It seems like the corporate South Africa has zero understanding as to what the ANC's actual objectives are and how they might be actively undermining them and things that they're doing. They just seem to be oblivious. And, you saw this in, a good example is the CEO of Discovery. He was all behind NHR when he thought he might be able to manage the fund, until it turned out that they had no intention of him managing the fund. And then he wanted to backtrack on everything and say, oh, NHR is a terrible disaster. But if you had read the ANC's ideology, or if you had understood what the ANC was attempting to achieve, this outcome of you not getting the contract should have been obvious. Like, it was never going to go to you. Like, you thought it was, but no one else did. So,
Yes.
but you do find this. I think the media has the exact same problem. I don't know if they're, some people would argue that they're paid off by the ANC, they're paid off by the government. Some people would say they're government owned. And you know how the conspiracy theories just generally tend to circulate. But there does seem to be a noticeable lack of interest from the journalistic class as to the underlying objectives going on. And I don't know if that's because, one, they don't understand, two, they have no interest, or three, they're just told, trust me, guy, it's not actually happening, it's all in your imagination. It could be any one of those. I don't know.
Yeah.
What's your view?
And well, I think again it goes back a long way. Sorry to be brief, but all the way back to the People's War, the first stage of the revolution, how the ANC got to power. They were much less popular among the black electorate than the Inkatha Freedom Party. Therefore, it was important to weaken and, if possible, destroy the Inkatha Freedom Party. So they had hundreds of their leaders assassinated and of their supporters attacked and killed. And yet the media never went into this. There was information available if you sat as I did and put together the reports, which were given very little coverage. You could begin to construct the picture. Instead, it was splash coverage on the things which painted Inkatha in a bad light, obviously, often very legitimately. If they're responsible for a mass attack, they needed to be criticized for that. But you also needed to look at all the smaller, the 10, 15 assassinations before then, which then prompted the mass attack. And that was not done. So having turned a blind eye to the ANC's role in political violence, perhaps it's harder to think that the ANC might not have this great moral authority that's very comforting to believe in, and might not be simply trying to act in the best interests of redress and transformation and the buzzwords that we've been talking about. Perhaps some also are quite sympathetic to the idea of increasing state control and sort of share the growing criticisms of a capitalist system and think it's not a bad thing if the state is taking ever more power. And somehow believe that this government will be good once it's got the power, which is really hard to believe.
Yeah, I mean, it's curious because one of the things that we obviously see is that during the People's War, the ANC thought it was perfectly acceptable to go all over the world and gun up support regardless of who listened. In fact, there were one of the allies that they decided to go with was actually, let's call them the world pariahs at the time, such as Cuba and Russia and so forth. and it didn't matter as far as they were concerned. Any ally that pushed forward the ending of apartheid was a good thing. But now, if you're AfriForum and you go abroad to speak to the United States about the plight of Afrikaners, you're a terrorist and a traitor to the country. It's amazing how it was good for them, but not good for you. The same thing happens now, and just so that I can give some balance, so that I'm not entirely just picking on the ANC, but you see a very similar thing. This would be the equivalent of an Afrikaner saying the Jewish people don't deserve their own state because they're giving a hard time to Palestinians, and it's Palestinian land, while simultaneously saying we want a homeland in South Africa, let us have our own segmented section. It's like these claims are not, they're like exclusive. If you're taking a principle, the principle needs to apply to both sides. It's not just a principle that applies for me today but not for you tomorrow. It's curious as to how this all seems to be going, because to a large degree there's an argument that central planning, the overbearing control of the state, the race-based legislation was exactly what the apartheid government was doing. You didn't like that. So is the allegation you did like it, you just didn't like who controlled it?
Yes. Yeah. Yep. I think that's right. So it's astonishing how the promise of non-racialism has really effectively been abandoned, even as we're told that the ANC is still committed to it.
And they do keep saying it. Non-sexist, non-racist, democratic society. I've heard it that many times. I can repeat it verbatim.
Yes, really, we all have been schooled in it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I really hope that you enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. It was good to have the chance to chat. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, see you soon. Bye.
Bye.